Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
All right, well, welcome everybody to another episode of the Examine Life with Phil, and this week I'm returning to the series I've been doing on the Problem of Divine Foreknowledge, and I've got here with me to discuss the Simple Foreknowledge viewpoint, Philip Swenson, who's a philosophy professor at the College of William and Mary. So thanks for coming on, Philip. It's nice to have somebody on who shares my name, who's a namesake. I haven't managed to do that yet, so I appreciate that. How are you doing this evening?
Doing great. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, well, yeah, thank you so much for coming. And yeah, I really do appreciate you coming on, because as I said when we were talking just before, this is the Simple Foreknowledge view is the one I had the hardest time finding like a representative for, as well as the hardest time finding some information about. Like, there's a couple of books where I can find somebody wrote an article about it, but with some of these other views like Monism or Open Theism, they've got their own Facebook groups devoted to them. It's so easy to find information about those ones, but this one, it's like kind of like, I don't know, you'll know better about this. I don't know if it's like just more obscure, or it's clearly not quite as popular.
It's such a moderate position, like it doesn't excite people. Like I don't know, that could be part of it too.
So it's kind of
like God knows some stuff, but not everything.
Yeah. So it's kind of like if you in a political group, if you were like trying to say we're the moderate independents, it'd be hard to get people excited about that. Okay, good.
We get it from both sides,
Cool. Okay. Well, I'm really curious to hear how this will go then. So, just to start off with, as I ask all the philosophers this, what's a odd philosophical viewpoint you hold? Like if you and I were at a conference together 2 years ago, if you'd have said that this view at the conference, what's a view that you hold that would have had people there kind of give you strange looks? Like, really, you think that?
Yeah, good. So one view I hold is that bad people get more credit for doing something good than good people do. So if you're a really virtuous person and you do something nice, that was easy for you. You don't get that much credit. If you're a really nasty, horrible person and you do something nice, well, you had to overcome that terrible character. So you actually get a lot of credit for that. So that's a view I hold that's at least pretty controversial.
Yeah, I can see that though. Like just whether or not that's right, I can just see that practically. That's really is the way people operate. I can just see all kinds of examples of that where people will be like, oh, well, yeah, he had to overcome so much, and yeah, he robbed a store, but at least he didn't murder anybody or anything like that. Whereas if I went out and robbed a store, I'm sure people would be willing to bring the hammer down on me since I don't have a history of committing crimes and things like that.
Right. Yeah. So we do talk this way in our, sentencing sometimes. Like, yeah, look, he had a tough upbringing. It was harder for him to do the right thing. And I guess the flip side is that I also say a really good person who does the wrong thing will be more blameworthy than the really bad person.
So do you think that actually like is morally the case, in addition to the way that we like just talk about it and kind of do speak about that in our speak about that in our everyday environment and things like that?
Yeah, exactly. So I'm worried about something that's called moral luck. So moral luck is when something outside your control affects how blameworthy you are, how praiseworthy you are. And if you give the good person just as much credit for doing something good as you give the bad person, it looks like they were really lucky. Like if you're born with just like a good character or something, then it's way easier for you to get lots of praise just because of luck, because born with less temptation to do bad or something. So the way to avoid that, the way to equal things out a little bit, is to give the bad person more credit. So I think that's the correct moral viewpoint.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I guess I'd have to think about that quite a bit, because my instinct there, and I'm not trying to be disingenuous when I say this, but my instinct would be to say, well, but there's so many caveats. How could we possibly like wind up measuring it that way, where you know that it's only moral luck that this person, that it's only because of moral luck that person genuinely was born with a better character. Maybe it's a combination of a bunch of other things and all this others, complications along those lines.
Yeah,
like,
good. So
they had good parents.
A good character like because you chose in the past to develop your character. And then that's just not luck. So what I would do there is I'd give you credit for those past good choices. I'd say, you get less credit for this because it was easier, but you get lots of credit for those past good choices where you became a better person.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. I'm definitely going to have to think about that as to whether or not that's the way it should be, whether that's the real, what's the phrase I'm looking for? Whether that's the way the moral element really is, or if it's just the way that people actually operate. Because, see, part of me thinks, you're onto something there, but the other part of me is like, but come on, I want full credit when I do the good things I do. So.
I kind of like the slogan, to whom much is given, much is required. So if you start out with great opportunities to do good because you just have less temptation or something, then more is expected of you before you're going to get a ton of credit.
Well, that's a very biblical principle. So as a Christian, that's a good way to appeal to me. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Well, that's really cool. That's very interesting. All right. Well, why don't we just move on and start talking about the problem of divine foreknowledge? I sent you. This is basically, I've sent everybody who I've talked to about this more or less the same notes. Then I just kind of edited a little bit around the particular viewpoint you're working from. And so this is the introduction I've been using with everybody, that the problem of divine foreknowledge, or PDF, is essentially, if God knows the future, how can we be free? And you can kind of say it where classically theism has tried to argue that God can control and foresee all things in a world where humans are free. Freedom, however, can exist in this context only in a verbal sense. There's room for this kind of freedom the Bible speaks of. Excuse me, I'm stumbling over my words here. I apologize. There is room for the kind of freedom the Bible speaks of if there is a God who knows or controls all things in a timeless. I did it again. I don't know what's wrong with me today. I guess I've had a long day. Right. There is no room for this kind of freedom if God controls or knows all things. Freedom means that reality is open in a way it cannot be open for such classical theism. That is, we've all heard examples of this. I think Planaga had one about a guy deciding to mow the lawn tomorrow, where if God knows eternally that he's going to mow the lawn, how can he decide to mow the lawn? And so there's formal arguments for it, like, one, necessarily if there's an eternally settled storyline, then Agent A chooses this and not that. Two, necessarily there is an eternally settled storyline, so therefore necessarily Agent A chooses this and not that. And there's the simple rendition that I like, which is necessarily if God foreknows X, then X will happen. Necessarily God foreknows X, therefore X will necessarily happen. And for people who are less philosophically inclined, I had a cup of coffee this afternoon. Well, if God foreknew that I was going to have a cup of coffee this afternoon, way back in 1000 BC, how could I be free to do it? And that's, loosely speaking, as best as I can tell, the problem. So my first question to you is, do you think that's a good way of explaining the problem, and why or why not?
Yeah, good. So on the version where you say, look, necessarily if God foreknows X, then X will happen. Necessarily God foreknows X, therefore X will necessarily happen. I think that's trying to get at the right thing, but I think that it kind of hides what's really the most, key part of the argument. So in order for that argument to work, you have to mean something kind of weird by necessarily. So sometimes philosophers, when they say necessarily, they mean it's something that happens in every possible world. But it's not true that in every possible world God foreknows that, I'll take a drink of water, because that doesn't happen in every possible world. So I looked up what the guy who gave that version meant by necessarily, and what he means there is it's necessary in the sense that it's beyond your control, right? it's something, the past is necessary in the sense that the past is necessary because the past is over and done with. The past is beyond your control. And I think that is the right way to put the point. The problem is, it seems like the past is fixed for us. The past is beyond our control. We can't do anything compatible with the past, right? That's sort of an intuition we have. Like, look, I can't do anything now about the fact that JFK was shot, 50-something years ago, right? And God's beliefs are part of the past. So I can't do anything, if I can't do anything incompatible with the past, I can't do anything incompatible with God believing a certain thing in the past. So if he believed I will drink water, given that he can't be wrong, I can't avoid drinking the water. So that's the way I like to think about it, is in terms of it seems like we can't do anything incompatible with the past being the way it is. So if God has beliefs about everything we do in the past, then the worry is we're not going to be free ever.
Yeah. And just for clarification for people who are listening, I took that argument from William Lane Craig, if other people want to go look it up. But I like that distinction you're making there is, well, what do we really mean by necessary? Because there are multiple ways you can mean necessary. That's a point Alan brought up when I talked to him about open theism, and I've done some stuff on the modal ontological argument. I had a nice podcast with Ben Arbor where we talked about that, and you can think of at least 2 or 3 different senses of how something can be necessary when you're discussing that. So, okay, that's a very good point. All right. So I like your summation there. So why don't we just go right into what the simple foreknowledge view is? I've got a quote here from David Hunt I'll read, and you can tell me if you think this is a good summation of it or not. As I said, I had a little bit of a hard time finding resources on this, but this is what he said was a simple foreknowledge view, at least. He says, "What I'm committed to defending is the view that God simply knows the future, leaving open the question of how he does it. By simple foreknowledge, then I shall mean the view that this simple affirmation of, here we go, God has complete and infallible knowledge of the future is uncomplicated by expectations, additions, qualifications, etc., and that by itself is wholly compatible with human freedom, divine agency, and hence providential control. If the reader finds it useful in following the arguments to think of God as inspecting the future through a time telescope," that's his metaphor there, "this should do little harm so long as it is understood that's not part of the thesis I'm defending here." So he kind of seems to think it's just saying, well, it just is the case that God knows the future, and that just is compatible with human freedom, and you don't need to then start appealing to Molinism, open theism, Calvinism, or all these other things.
Yeah, good. So I think, so if you take it that way, then as you said, it might be compatible with Molinism or something stronger. But I think when people say they accept simple foreknowledge, a lot of times what they mean is mere simple foreknowledge. So I believe God has comprehensive knowledge of the future, but he doesn't have something stronger like what the Molinists or the Calvinists think he has, right? So he can't determine our actions and they still be free, like a certain type of Calvinist might think. And he doesn't know what would happen in every possible situation, right? Like the Molinist thinks. So he knows the future, but he doesn't have this greater type of control or knowledge. Other view. So that might make it, so I think, so we could call that mere simple foreknowledge, and that makes it kind of its unique position in a way, maybe.
Okay, I see. So I guess if I'm understanding you right, it's sort of like everybody who is an Orthodox Christian and agrees that God knows the future and humans have some type of libertarian freedom, more or less takes kind of a broad picture, simple foreknowledge view, in that they all affirm those things. But then, like the Molinist or the open theist then says, but there has to be some further explanation of this, and then dives into that, where if I'm understanding what you're getting at with mere simple foreknowledge better, you're kind of saying, but we don't need to even dive into those things. In fact, maybe that's problematic and there's reasons we shouldn't.
Well, it's not that there's no deeper explanation. That maybe there is, maybe there isn't. It's that God doesn't have this even more robust type of control that the Molinist and the Calvinists think that he has. So he has the type of control that comes from knowing the future, but he doesn't have, this extra knowledge of like what you would do if he made a purple elephant appear in the room right now. He doesn't know that, so he can't use that like the Molinist thinks he can, and he can't just determine you to take a drink of water, to freely take a drink of water, like the Calvinist, like a certain type of Calvinist might think. So it's like accepting that he has foreknowledge and denying that he has more is what I'm thinking of as mere simple foreknowledge, which makes it kind of a unique position in a way.
Yeah, it's so just to help me understand a bit more, are you saying then that like those further, well, no, they're not further explanations. You're rejecting kind of like stronger explanations, I guess would be a better way to say it, where you're saying, no, it's more, like you said earlier, much more moderate, where you're saying, well, yeah, God knows, but he doesn't know everything we're going to do in any given situation. Like the example I like to use is, if Molinism's right, God knows exactly what I would do if I was the president of the U.S., which is probably why I'm not the president of the U.S. But if it really is the case that I'm never going to be elected president in the future under mere simple foreknowledge, then no, God wouldn't know that.
Right,
or
exactly.
The deterministic Calvinistic view. Okay.
Right. So there may be a deeper explanation of how he knows what he knows, but he doesn't know these other further things that would be useful if he could know them. Yeah. He doesn't know what you would do if you were president or something. Yeah.
Okay. Well, then my question to you is, well, how does this work in solving the problem? Because it kind of, we should maybe distrust our intuitions a little bit, but it almost intuitively just seems like this is something that cries out for a little bit more of a explanation than just that, which is, why there are all these views. So how does this go about solving the problem?
So simple foreknowledge isn't a solution to the problem. It's just a view about, it's just a view that says the problem can be solved, right? And then you could give many different types of solution to the problem. So what I'll try to do is explain what I think is a good solution that gets you simple foreknowledge, but won't necessarily get you Molinism or Calvinism or something.
Okay, cool.
Does that sound good? Or?
Yeah, I like that. But then I guess the caveat you would probably give is somebody else who takes the simple foreknowledge view might then have a different explanation than the one you're going to give us.
Exactly, right. So there are at least two different, or as I see it, there's at least two different types that people have given, and I like one of them more than the other. So I'll defend mine. And Well, please do. Go dive right in. So
let us. Yeah.
So go back to this thought that the past is fixed, right? The past is beyond our control, where that means I can't do anything incompatible with the past. I take that to be what really motivates this problem. Look, God believed it a long time ago that I would take a drink. He can't be wrong. So I can't do anything incompatible with that, right? I can't do anything incompatible with what was true in the past. So I think we should ultimately reject that intuition. And we should say, actually, what's true is you can't do anything about what I call the independent past. The past that's true, independent, the facts about the past that are true, independent of what you do. And the reason, it seems so intuitive that the past is fixed is because we normally assume that the whole past is independent of our choices. But if what's true in the past could depend on what we do now, then I think it won't seem like the past is fixed. So start by thinking about a time travel story. So suppose whether time travel is really possible or not, right? Suppose you've come to believe time travel is possible, right? Maybe some physicists have convinced you, right? And they're like, look, this will work. And you think you're sitting in the time machine, and you think that if you push the red button, you'll appear in 1492. So suppose you believe all that. I think in that circumstance, it wouldn't seem to you like the past was beyond your control anymore. It would seem to you like you could determine whether somebody appeared in 1492 or not. You can think, yeah, I can push the button, and if I do, I'll appear in the past. If I don't push the button, nobody who looks like me will appear in the past. So the past really is under my control in a certain sort of way. And why would it seem that way? Because if you have a time machine, what happens in the past depends on what happens in the future.
Yeah, so, it's no longer fixed at that point. It becomes more like the future.
Backwards explanation where what happens in the future can explain the past. Like if you push the button, that would explain why someone appeared in the past. Then it doesn't seem like the past is beyond our control anymore. Any questions about that so far? Is that kind of making sense?
Yeah, I can see how that would, if I believed all that, then I wouldn't think the past is fixed anymore. But then my mind goes to, well, but is it really that way? Like, okay, you've shown me that that's the way I think about it, but is the way I think about it really matching up with reality? Yeah,
good. So maybe tell me if this isn't getting at your question, but my thought is I want to say that the existence of God, the existence of an essentially omniscient being, functions kind of like the way a time machine functions, where it creates this link between the future and the past. The fact that in the past there exists this essentially omniscient being makes it the case that the past can depend on the future in certain ways. So just like things get weird if there's a time machine, things get weird if there's an essentially all-knowing being in the past, because then what I do now actually affects what happened 1,000 years ago, because it affects what God believed 1,000 years ago. So if you're a theist who thinks God's essentially omniscient, then you should think, oh yeah, turns out we do live in this weird kind of world that's kind of like a world where time travel is possible.
Okay, so in a certain sense, you would take a variant of the problem of divine foreknowledge that atheists would use to say, see, there is no God, and you'll turn it on his head and say, no, this if you're already committed to the idea that there is a God, what this shows us is that there's some type of backwards causation going on, so to speak.
Yes, good, or at least backwards dependence or backwards explanation going on, where somehow what I do now is sort of prior to the past in a certain way, where what I do now can explain why the past is the way that it is.
Okay.
And that's because of the weirdness of an essentially all-knowing being, right? That's a very interesting thing to have there in the past.
I don't think I've heard that. I don't think I've heard that before. That's very interesting. You might almost say, well, you probably wouldn't be comfortable with this characterization, but some other people might say you're kind of like biting the bullet, so to speak, of PDF and just running with it. Is that, yeah.
Yeah, I'm saying some things that people will find counterintuitive. So I'm saying that it's possible for the past to depend on the future, right? And I think one possible instance would be time travel, and another possible instance would be there's an essentially all-knowing God. I don't find that to be so crazy. Time travel doesn't seem like inherently impossible to me, but to some people it does, and so they would see me as biting a bullet. Yeah.
Yeah, I've gone kind of back and forth on that. I think it kind of depends on what you think of what your theory of time is, and then I think from what. I'm not a physicist, but I've liked watching documentaries about what, theoretical physicists say and things like that. I think they've more or less established that it's certainly possible to do time travel in the sense of traveling into the future. Like if you go at the speed of light or something like that, you're doing time travel in a sense, but it's not the same thing we mean when we're talking about a movie like Back to the Future or something like that. So it seems from what the people who do that kind of physics are telling me that in that kind of weaker, lesser sense that isn't near as exciting, it's certainly possible. But you seem to be much more appealing to something like Back to the Future than, if we go faster, it's than the speed of light when we come back, everybody will have aged 300 years and you'll only have aged like 3 years or something like that.
Yeah, so I don't want to say that backwards time travel is compatible with the physics of the actual world. I don't know. I have no idea. I don't know enough physics to know that. So when I say it's possible to me, I mean, it seems possible in the sense that there's some possible world where you have backwards time travel, and that might be a world where the laws of physics are different than they are. So I think the laws of physics are not necessary, right? So if you think God could have made different fundamental physical laws, then you might think, yeah, even if actual physics rules out backward time travel, there might be a different possible physics that
I see. Yeah, I think I get what you're understanding. You're using possible there in kind of a very broad sense, just to simply mean it's not incoherent, it's not self-contradictory. There's nothing that's prima facie ridiculous or contradictory about the idea of traveling in time back to the past.
Yeah, it's not. We say it's not metaphysically impossible in the sense that it couldn't have happened no matter what, or something.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I can see that, and that just intuitively seems right to me. It's not like I cry foul every time I see a time travel movie or something. Right. It certainly makes sense in and of itself, at least. So.
Right. It seems coherent. It seems plausible. That it could be that way. Right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So, well, yeah, I guess if you do take that route, that would kind of would solve the problem. Where, or do you have some more explanations as to how that would work? Or
okay, yeah, good. So, so let me say whether that alone solves the problem. Some philosophers have said, no, even if the future depends on the past, the past depends on the future. Well, still the past is beyond our control. And so I would also have to reject that. I'd say, no, the only reason we think the past is beyond our control is because we think that the past is independent of the future. So to fully solve the problem, I also have to say, once you get that the past can depend on the future, either by time travel or by God's foreknowledge, then the past isn't always beyond our control. So I'd have to add that claim. Let's see. So were you wanting to go into like how it works? How?
Yeah,
these things.
I find this very interesting. Yeah, give me some more explanations as to how this would work. Yeah.
So I'll give you two models, and I think different people will like different ones maybe. But so one model is just a simple backwards causation model, right? Given God's essential omniscience, he's able to be causally impacted by future events. So like literally my lifting the glass causes God's past belief, right? So that would be one model. That kind of fits with in the Hunt quote you were reading, where God has like a time telescope, right? When we see, when we learn by seeing things, that's a causal way of learning, right? The light bounces off the wall, and that causes me to believe there's a wall there. So you could kind of take it as kind of like seeing the future, right? The future stuff's actually causing God's past beliefs. So that would be one way. If you don't like backwards causation, which some people don't, some people think, no, causation has to flow forward. That's what it is to be causation or something. Here's a different model that doesn't have any backwards causation in it. So philosophers talk about something called truth making. So, why is it true that the computer's on the desk? Well, because of some, event or thing in the world, the computer's being on the desk that makes that claim true.
Yeah, right? I picked it up and put it there in the case of my computer.
Yeah, right. Or just it's being there makes it true that it's there, or something, trivial even like that. So you could say, why was it true 1,000 years ago that Philip will lift his glass in 1,000 years? Well, because this future event of Philip's lifting his glass, that's the truth maker. So that So on this view, the future exists. There's a future event, my lifting my glass, that makes it true 1,000 years ago. That I would lift my glass in 1,000 years. So the relation there isn't causation. It's this other thing called truth making. So then once it's true 1,000 years ago, God can just know that based on it being true then, right? And that can be a relationship between its truth then and his belief. And it doesn't require any backward causation.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Yeah. Yeah, it does seem quite counterintuitive to me that there could be some kind of backwards causation like that, because we can certainly all think of what standard forward causation is. I lift up my glass and take a drink of water and my mouth gets wet and I don't feel thirsty anymore. And I'm pretty sure you can come up with examples of even simultaneous causation. There's the example, I think it originated with Kant, where he talks about maybe it was a dog or a bowling ball or something sitting on a pillow from eternity past, where the depression is caused, in a sense, by the dog or the bowling ball on the pillow. Yeah. But there doesn't necessarily have to be any time there if it's from eternity past. It's always been that way, so it's simultaneous. But then going to backwards causation, that seems like part of me just wants to balk at that. So is that like a position you would want to try and take or defend?
I don't balk at it because, like I said, time travel seems possible to me, and time travel does involve backward causation. But that's why I want to give alternative models, because there are people who, like you, who go, wait a minute, that seems a little weird. So I think if we want to solve the problem of foreknowledge in a way that convinces as many people as possible, it's better to come up with models that can appeal to people who don't like backward causation.
Okay, yeah. And the other thing that comes to my mind is maybe you should discuss a little bit more about how truth-making in your second model is actually distinct from backward causation, because it almost kind of seems like you're, and I know you're not doing this, but it seems a little bit at least like you're just kind of throwing out the term causation and putting truth maker in instead, and it's still kind of working the same way.
Yeah, that's good. So, so like, why isn't truth making just a type of causation? Is that
more or less? Yeah.
That's a good question. So philosophers sometimes distinguish between like explanations that go forward through time. So like, so you said, look, so Wes, why is the computer on the table? And you say, because I put it there, right? That seems like a causal explanation, right? Where that was the cause in the past of its being there now, right? Another thing you could have said is because the atoms that make up the computer are there. And so that, instead of going forward, it's going like up, right? From the more fundamental thing, the atoms, to the less fundamental thing, the computer. So philosophers usually use causation for the first type of thing, and then say, and then want to call the other type of thing something else, a different type of explanation or a different type of dependence. So I'm kind of saying, well, truth making is more like that other type of dependence. So even if you think causation shouldn't be backwards, maybe you could grant that this other type of dependence could run backwards. But still, you could say, well, really, we should just use causation as this broader word that means every type of real explanation. And in that sense, I would have to say there could be backward causation.
Okay.
But if you use causation in that more narrow way, we can avoid that.
Yeah, I'm not sure where I would want to go with that. I haven't really looked in a great deal of depth into how we should categorize causation like that, but it does seem to me that saying everything should be categorized as causation, that's probably a bit too strong to take. Right. I tend to get very suspicious of any viewpoint that takes everything that broadly. So
good, yeah. Okay. Yeah, so if our intuition against backward causation is about the more narrow thing, then appealing to a different type of explanation that's not causation in that narrow sense might help, is the idea.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. This just occurs to me. I don't know, for people who listen to the podcast who are less philosophically inclined, maybe the example that comes to my mind is we tend to run these together in everyday languages, but we do speak of causes in many different senses, even in everyday languages. Like you said, why is the computer on my desk? Well, the atoms are arranged there. And I said, well, I put it there. But even in just saying, well, I put it there, well, there's the causal explanation in the sense of the terms of events, but then there's also like a purpose as to why I did that. There's kind of a teleological explanation too, which, I put it there because we were going to have this conversation this evening, and it was to record a podcast and things along those lines. And that's not at all the same kind of explanation, the same kind of cause, if we want to use that term, as the chain of events where I picked it up and put it there.
Yeah, good. So that might be even a third type of explanatory relation, besides just the normal causal one and the atoms were there type of explanation. So you're right. So you could be even more than two types of genuine explanatory things. There could be a teleological one too. Yeah,
and we just, in everyday language, we tend to run all those together all the time, where somebody will say, well, why did you do that? And people will sometimes give like a chain of causal events, and they'll sometimes actually say, oh, I did it for this reason, for this purpose. And we just usually don't even distinguish between those two. Okay.
Yeah. And so some people might say that's because the teleological one reduces to the other one. But that's a controversial question, right? Whether the purposes can be reduced just to standard causation. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. That I guess my quick take on that would be, if you believe in any sense of libertarian freedom or free will, I think you'd want to be inclined to resist that. But if you're going to take the deterministic viewpoint, then you almost have to say, well, yeah, of course it all reduces to just a chain of events. But if you take the deterministic viewpoint, there is no problem of divine foreknowledge. So what are we talking about? Okay, good deal. Well, did you have any more to say about those viewpoints you take and want to defend, or?
Let's see. I think that's my pitch for my view. Yeah.
Okay, good.
So maybe we should talk about the objections you wanted to raise or something like that.
Yeah, we'll go into these. The first objection I heard to Simple Foreknowledge came from Greg Boyd, who takes an open theistic view himself. And he says that it essentially makes God kind of impotent in that he can't control the future. And the way I understood this objection is I read the comic Watchmen and saw the movie a while back. Are you familiar with that by chance? Did you?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Well, the character of Dr. Manhattan in that comic and movie, he sees the future exactly like the past. In a certain sense, he kind of buys into what you're saying there, where he's like, no, they're the same. But the problem, at least for the character in the comic, is because he sees the future and the past exactly identical, he sees the future in a very fatalistic sense where, yeah, he does things and he, so to speak, makes choices in air quotes, but he'll like see the future and be like, it's going to happen. There's nothing that can be done about it. He kind of takes a very fatalistic attitude. And Greg Boyd's saying, well, this turns God into Dr. Manhattan. He sees the future, but he can't do anything about it. And that seems to directly contradict with how Christians have understood God for pretty much as long as Christians have understood God in any way, where we always tend to see God as moving and having action and doing things and making the world in certain ways and preventing other things from happening, doing miracles and things along those lines. So how would you respond to that objection?
Yeah, good. So I think, the best thing to say here is there's still a structure to God's to God's knowledge and decision making. So are you familiar with how Molinists think there's like 3 moments of God's knowledge? Like first he knows like the logical truths, and then he knows what would happen, and then he makes some decisions, and then he knows what will happen. right?
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
all
That
supposed to happen
mhm.
instantaneously, but there's still a structure to his knowledge, right? So I think
Yeah,
we
I've
should
heard
think
that
of it as
before.
like, oh, he sees everything before he makes any decisions. He sees some things, then he makes some decisions, and then he can see more. Even though that all happens instantaneously, there's still a structure to his decision making and his knowledge. So I'll use an example. An example I liked from David Hunt, right? So
Mhm.
David Hunt, in arguing for the usefulness of simple foreknowledge, says, look, if simple foreknowledge is right, God will never lose paper, rock, scissors. Whereas if open theism is right, he could lose a paper, rock, scissors game, right? So
Yeah.
the structure would go like this. God looks at a part of the future, sees, oh, the devil threw scissors. It says, okay, well, then I'm going to throw rock. And then he sees he throws rock. That all happens instantaneously. All that happens in like one moment of time, but there's still the structure where he knows one thing, makes a decision, then knows another thing. So it's sort of like Molinism in that there's a structure to his decision making, even though there's not a time where he doesn't know.
So there's like a certain sense of causal priority, even though there's not time.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah. I could easily buy into that. I mean, I gave that example about the dogs and pillows earlier, so yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Oh yeah, so you accept instantaneous explanations already, so
Yeah. I came to that conclusion when I was doing research on the modal ontological argument, because somebody had given a version of it a while back that is no longer accepted or thought to be good, because that was the good objection somebody else raised to it, and says, no, we've got we can have causal relations without time, so this variant doesn't work, and nobody really talks about it anymore because that kind of knocked it down. So
okay. Yeah, cool. I will say that there is something to the Boyd objection, though, because there are certain things God isn't going to be able to do.
Okay.
So,
like what?
So, like, God can't go, I see that Phil is a really generous guy who would give away any money that he got, who will give away all his money, so I'm going to make him rich. I see that he will give away $1 million, so I'll give him $1 million to give away. I think God won't be able to do that because that would generate sort of an explanatory circle, right? So he sees that you'll give away the money, so he gives you the money, but you can only give away the money because you got it from God. So I think that's impossible. So there's some limits on his providential control if you think there can't be explanatory circles or explanatory loops. So he can't give you money because he sees that you will give it away, for example.
Okay. So it sort of would have to be like he would be wanting to give me money for another reason, and then for a completely different reason, I also happen to have a generous character.
Right. Or he could act like the open theist God there and go, well, I see that, I haven't peaked yet on whether he will give away the money, but I see that there's a high probability. So before I peak, I'll go ahead and decide to give him the money. He could do that.
So
yeah.
This might be kind of not the best metaphor, but it would sort of be like God can give me the money if he closes his eyes while he's doing it.
Exactly. Yes. So God has to be very strategic about when to look at different parts of the future as he exercises his providential control. But fortunately, God is extremely smart, so he'll be able to strategize through all. Yeah. You and I would be a total mess of it if we were in that situation.
Yeah. Everybody who takes any viewpoint on this subject all agrees God is extremely smart. So no doubt about that. Yeah. Okay.
I'll give one more example where I do think you get genuine providential usefulness, more realistic case than the paper, rock, scissors. So think about praying about things that have already happened, right? You get an email, you check your email, you see that last night your friend was going into surgery. The surgery is probably over already, but I think on the simple foreknowledge model, it would make sense for you to pray now that God, protect him during surgery. That could explain God's past belief that you will pray in the future, and then that belief could explain his protecting him in the surgery. So I think that's real that you don't get on open theism.
I actually did that when I was a kid, not in reference to surgery, but my dad's a pastor, and so he had some missionaries come to the church, and they were going to be like children's missionaries in it was some country in South America. I don't remember exactly which one. And they sent a newsletter to the church where they talked about how they were going to go hold a kids crusade at this certain village or whatever. And I kept praying as a little kid, I think it was 7 or 8, for that kids crusade they were going to hold, even though I knew at a certain point they've already done it, because my thinking at the time was, well, I figure God can, take my prayers now and make it work in the past because he's God. I didn't have all these philosophical and theological reasons for it, but that's kind of how I thought about it as a little 7, 8-year-old kid. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, good. So I think that would make sense on the simple foreknowledge model. So that might be an advantage of it.
I guess we can say that when I was 7 or 8, that's the viewpoint I took then. So,
so you knew this all along.
Apparently, yeah. Okay. All right. Well, the other objection that I've came up with this is that, we've talked about this a little bit already, but on Hunt's definition that I talked about, broad simple foreknowledge does seem to be compatible with pretty much every viewpoint. But the objection that I would level there, and I guess you can talk about whether or not you think this is applicable to your mere simple foreknowledge viewpoint, is that this seems to kind of turn God's knowledge into just like a brute fact, where you would just say, well, it just is, or at least it can do that. Maybe Hunt and yourself would want to resist that and say that, but where if you're just going to say it's just a brute fact, well, things kind of need explanations. As a general rule, I think in good philosophical and theological thinking, you don't want to say it's a brute fact. Even people who are appealing to brute facts usually try and find a way to categorize it or label it differently for that reason.
Yeah, good. So I think it's unavoidable to appeal to brute facts somewhere, but you're right. I think it's better if we can go deeper. And so that's kind of, why I wanted to give those models of how it would work, where you're not just saying, oh, he just does know. You could say something about the mechanism of how he knows. I do think in general for theists, it's like, well, how does God know everything? And I think one move you can try to make there is, well, God's nature is essentially such that it's just metaphysically necessary that he knows everything. And if you think, so you probably thought a little bit about this maybe since you think about ontological arguments, but you might think sometimes the fact that something has to be can be an explanation of why it is. So God has to know everything. And that explains why he does know these things. So that might be another move you could try to make here.
Yeah, I'd be sympathetic to that, because if you're going to claim that God is necessary in the sense that ontological arguments claim he's necessary, well, I can see how that some people then turn around and say, well, that's just a brute fact. That's just circular. And I don't think it really is, but it is a little bit like that at the same time, where, well, why is God necessary? Well, because he's God, and any God worth being called God is necessary. And that's an explanation that I don't think is circular and not a brute fact, but it's not really the best of explanations either. You, like you're saying, would want some kind of more of a mechanism for why that is, but I honestly can't for the life of me think of how you would even begin to have a mechanism for something like that. So
I do think theists will probably at some point have to say something like, well, so why is God this way? Well, that's just what it is to be the best possible being. And that's just definitional, and that's the brute fact. It's something like the definition of the best possible being, or something like that.
Yeah.
But if we can reduce the foreknowledge issue to that type of thing, I think that's some progress too.
Yeah, that would definitely be progress, because there's still issues there, but that's certainly better, at least. So, okay. Yeah, and after you go through your model, you went through your models and explanations. It doesn't seem at all to me that the viewpoint you're taking falls into this, oh, it's just a brute fact thing. I wrote that objection out before I'd heard your models.
Right.
So, okay. The other objection that I found, and I did have a little bit of a hard time finding objections because, again, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot. I guess it's kind of just a nature of the beast. When there aren't a whole lot of people going around writing in favor of the view, there also aren't a whole lot of people who write objections.
Right.
But the other one I found is that came from William Lane Craig, where he says that simple foreknowledge makes fatalism true. And of course, the fatalism is counterintuitive to our everyday lived experience. It really does seem to me like I decided to contact you and say, hey, do you want to come on the podcast and talk about this simple foreknowledge and these viewpoints? Not that I didn't have any choice. And I find that for almost everybody, that really is their lived experience. And I'm kind of suspicious of the people who claim otherwise. I think they're being a little disingenuous.
Right.
So how would you respond to that?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, I'd have to, I wonder why he thinks that, I guess, I'm not sure why he thinks that, but I don't think simple foreknowledge makes fatalism true. So fatalism says, because it was true 1,000 years ago that you would contact me, it wasn't up to you whether to contact me. You weren't free in contacting me, right? And I think we should answer that the same way we answer the foreknowledge problem and say, no, the reason it was true 1,000 years ago is because of your decision. You actually have power over the past, and you can control what happened in the past. And so yeah, it was true 1,000 years ago that you would contact me, but that's because of your decision to contact me, and so that's not a threat to your freedom.
Yeah, it's not fatalism in the sense that we typically think about it then, because I did make a choice, and the choice then affected what happened in the past.
Yeah.
Okay.
I will say, so I think Craig is one of these philosophers who doesn't believe the future exists. So he would probably object to what we just said, because I said, well, what made it true 1,000 years ago was your decision. And on his view, your decision doesn't exist, so it couldn't be there to make it true.
Okay,
I'm a philosopher who believes that it's called eternalism. I believe that all times exist. So I think your future choices exist. Whereas Craig, I think, doesn't think that. So he might object to that way of fatalism.
So refresh my memory. I've looked into this, but I don't remember the terms. So that you're taking A theory of time versus Craig taking a B theory of time, or did I get that backwards?
The other way around, yeah.
Okay, so you're taking the B theory of time where Craig takes the A theory of time.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Well, that might be worth explaining what that is a little bit, since that ties into this objection then, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I'll put it, so I'll put it in terms of eternalism and presentism. So eternalists say that all times exist, right? Past times exist, future, the past exists, the future exists. Presentists say that only the present exists, right? So they can't say the future stuff is out there explaining why the present exists, why the present is the way it is. So they can't say, so there might be a worry for them about saying, oh, it's because of my future choice that it was true 1,000 years ago. Because 1,000 years ago, my future choice didn't exist. Well, I think presentists, ultimately, I think that isn't a problem, though, because presentists have to make sense of explanation across times. Right? So they say only the present exists. Well, we think past things explain present things. We think that the computer is on the desk.
Yeah, okay.
And they say, oh, well, the past doesn't exist. Nonetheless, you still have to make sense of this explanation across times. So I think even presentists should
interesting. Okay.
Should ultimately admit that we can make sense of that. Now, Craig's extra interesting because I think he accepts what's called the growing block theory, where the past exists and the present exists, but the future doesn't exist. So this is kind of a minority view where the past and the present both exist, the future doesn't exist. So he could make sense of the past explaining present things, but say still the future couldn't explain anything because the past exists, it can explain things, but the future doesn't exist, so it can't. So he would have a way, a move that even the presentist can't make there. But I have different objections to the growing block theory. I don't know if you want to get into that or.
That might be getting into different territory. Maybe I should have you back on someday to have a whole discussion on different theories of time and philosophy of time, because that's fascinating, interesting stuff that I've looked into a little bit, but haven't studied in depth. But what I found as we're getting into now is which viewpoint you take actually then dictates a lot of how you're going to respond to various philosophical and theological questions, because the A theory of time necessarily includes and excludes certain viewpoints, and same thing with the B theory of time.
Right.
Yeah, okay, well, that's where I broke up Philip and I's conversation. As has so often been the case with these discussions on the problem of divine foreknowledge, this one went a bit long too, so the second part of it I'll air next week. In the meantime, you can always write in and let me know what you think. You can reach me at theexaminedlifewithphil@gmail.com, or contact me at the Facebook group that I started for the podcast called The Examined Life with Phil. Thanks for listening, and part 2 of Philip and I's discussion on Simple Foreknowledge will be up next week.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.